Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
Eerie towns, disappearing diners, and creepy gas stations. What's your true, unexplained story of being in a place that shouldn't exist? Episode 5. Okay, so, many years ago, my mom took my siblings and I, aged 10 and under, on a road trip to visit some of our extended family, aunt, uncle, 2 cousins also 10 and under. A few days earlier, aunt and uncle had taken their daughters to a small town about 30 minutes away for a strawberry festival. We live in a specific American state known for having basically nothing to celebrate besides agriculture. It was a big hit for the girls, so they figured they'd go back again once we all got there. Well, unbeknownst to any of us, the festival had ended literally the day before our arrival, and apparently all the cool attractions and vendors of the community had left as well. My aunt was driving us all around in circles while her girls were trying to figure out what happened to all the party stuff and where everyone was. Now, it's also important to note that it was the middle of one of the hottest seasons on record in our state, think 110 degrees Fahrenheit or more per day, so, it makes sense that with the festival gone, most folks were staying inside at either their local businesses or homes to try to keep cool, most folks. My little brother immediately points out the car window at the first sign of life we'd seen since the 10 minutes we'd spent driving around trying to find the festival that was no longer going down. There is a man jogging down the street in cherry red, skin-tight long johns, on the off chance anyone's confused about what those are, picture-matching long-sleeved, thermal shirt and pants, usually worn as pajamas or as additional underlayers for keeping warm in winter. The only other sign of life we saw that day before we gave up was someone dropping one of those large old-fashioned, boxy televisions off of an apartment roof. The adults were confused/freaked out. Us kids thought it was hilarious. We still joke about the weirdness of it all at family reunions. I lived in Manhattan in the mid-80s and on 34th Street, way up by 7th or 8th or maybe even higher. I used to like to go to this place you got into by escalator from the street. It led up to this really dark sales floor, never any staff around, very dark, and dusty, with rails of clothing very sparse and everything looking like it came out of the 1930s. Smelled of smoke. I always felt like I went someplace not of this reality when I went there. Tried finding it on Google Maps, nothing there. One day I was flying back from Boston and our flight was rerouted to someplace insanely south like Georgia or wherever by a storm. We had to stay overnight. There was a couple on the flight with my friend and I that were foreign, Middle Eastern of some sort, and the woman at the counter simply could not understand them at all. My friend and I understood them simply fine through their accents, so we helped the woman at hot counter sort out their tickets and got them set up with a comp room down the hall from us. In the morning we took a cab with them and got them on their flight. Everyone we talked to swore that they were not speaking English and if the counter we had been at with them was not an uninstalled hole in the wall the next day. To this day, I'm not sure what happened to them, but I'm glad we were there to help. This is what me and my friends refer to as the pay phone incident. Pay phones have died out, but they used to be all over the place. This was the razor flip phone era, so pay phones were becoming less and less popular. We were on our way back from the Oregon coast. One of us had to work early the next day, so we decided to take a faster route back to Portland. There was this small town that none of us can remember the name of or has seen on trips to Portland since then. We stopped at a diner that was pretty run down. The town itself had only a few buildings, some hidden from the main road by the surrounding forest. As soon as we got out of the car we heard a pay phone ring. We realized it was coming from a rusty phone booth outside sitting under one of the few street lamps around. I didn't pick up the phone, but my friend didn't even hesitate. He said he only heard breathing. When we went inside the diner the server, an older woman, told us that if we needed a payphone we could use the phone inside the diner because that payphone hadn't worked for a couple of years. When we told her that we heard it ringing her eyes went wide and a bit wild and she wouldn't say anything else. We said we picked up the phone and heard someone breathing. She went into the kitchen in the back and a few minutes later a man, I assume the cook, came out and told us they were closing. It all happened so fast and then we booked it out of there. It comes up in conversation sometimes and it still freaks us all out thinking about it. My friend was moving cross-country, and I flew out to help her drive. We both are not good at navigating, so on the second day, we found ourselves on some back road in West Virginia in the middle of the night. Neither of our phones had service, but her Garmin faithfully led us on detour after detour until finally we were led to a completely closed road. We decided to go the opposite way of the GPS. Several minutes later, the trees and random shacks gave way to a literal oasis. There was a freaking resort community in the middle of absolutely nowhere, lively and wide awake in the middle of the night. The streets were cobblestone. The streetlights sparkled, there were fountains and flowers everywhere. We felt like we were on a tropical island. There were upscale designer stores, Louis Vuitton and the like. We saw an open restaurant, and even though we looked like sloppy peasants, we went in to ask for directions. A server cheerfully explained that the closed road we had seen was not really closed, it just looked that way. She told us we could still take it, and it would get us out to the freeway in a moment. She gave us some free cheesecake in beautiful boxes and wished us safe travels. We got back on the road, returned to the closed road, and carefully drove around the closed signs. We drove through the absolute darkest section of road I've ever seen, and sure enough, found the freeway shortly after. We pulled off at the first motel we could find and went to sleep and spent most of the next day Googling the town. We still haven't found it. The whole trip was gone from the Garmin. The cheesecake boxes were gone from the car. We wanted to go back, but at the same time, we were completely terrified, like, what even just happened? I'm a park ranger at Mammoth Cave National Park. There is an insane number of people 25 to 30, myself included, who remember going on boat tours in Mammoth Cave during school trips through the early to mid-2000s. The only thing is, they stopped giving boat tours in the early 90s. Everyone that I have talked about describes it all the same way, and in great detail. The boats didn't even exist there after the 94s. As a lad of about 15, I was walking through a suburban neighborhood with a few of my friends. It was a warm summer night, very humid, probably around 2 to 3 a.m. We had no aim in mind, we were just wandering between our secret smoking spots. At some point, a fairly dense layer of fog settled over the neighborhood. We rounded a corner and found ourselves facing a typical, albeit foggy, cul-de-sac. We'd all patrolled this neighborhood hundreds of times and knew it by heart. None of us recognized this cul-de-sac or any of the houses on it. We looked to see what street we just turned off and saw another cul-de-sac ending in a dead end. This was the street we had just come from. Not only was it not what it was supposed to be, it wasn't even how we remembered it from literally 90 seconds prior. We now stood at a T-shaped three-way intersection, but there was no street sign. All of the houses looked perfectly normal, just not how we remembered them. Faced with two dead ends, we chose to walk down the only road we hadn't tried yet. It seemed a little bit longer than the others, but within a minute or two we realized that it was just another dead-end cul-de-sac. We were unnerved. There were cars parked in the driveways of some of the houses, but there was no road connecting to this weird, foggy little T-shaped intersection of three dead ends. We tried not to panic, agreed that we were probably just high and confused, and decided to walk all the way around the perimeter of this impossible three-way dead end. Sure enough, we walked back up and down all three streets. No entrance, no exit. After a brief debate about what was going on and what we should do, we cut through one of the side yards. The house backed up to another house on an adjacent street, and this put us back to familiar ground. We were too spooked to retrace our steps that night, but in the morning, we went to investigate this bizarre suburban triangle in the light of day. This is where it gets complicated. See, none of us could agree where exactly it was that we had come out after cutting through the yard. We knew this neighborhood very well, and we'd all thought that we immediately knew where we had come out of the yard, and, clearly we all made it home. Somehow, we'd still managed to leave with different impressions of where we'd come from. There was nothing menacing about the three-way dead end, it was just spooky. As an adult looking back, I will be the first to concede the possibility that reefer-fueled teenage imaginations were just running wild on a quiet, foggy night. Still, it wasn't like we'd never smoked weed before, and the fog wasn't really that bad. We totally had visibility. There is no reason we would have hallucinated, and aside from the yard that connects it to the rest of the world. We'd all had exactly the same experience, speaking freely with each other about the experience as it was happening. I don't have an alternative theory. Sometimes, this life is just intensely strange. We had a lot of woods in the back of our property when I was a kid, and I was always exploring, often by myself. I knew the woods pretty well and had quite a few little hideout spots. One day I was exploring with a neighbor kid, and he wanted to show me something really cool, so I followed him to a small clearing and it was filled with vehicles. This was in the middle of the woods. There were trucks, cars, construction equipment, etc. Some of it was incredibly old and some of it seemed pretty new. I'd say there were at least 20 vehicles there. I never went back because I didn't remember how to get there. I've read in other places about people with similar experiences. Why are there cars in the middle of the woods? I was driving in upstate New York, somewhere near the Canadian border. It was 8 a.m. and I stopped to get gas. The station was at a Y in the road and dead center of the main road. I was looking down the street and noticed that one side was houses and the other was all stores. As I was pondering this, nearly every house's front door opened, everyone waved to each other, walked straight across the street, and went into the business opposite the house. Totally freaked me out. I cut the fill-up short and got out fast. So, I'm in the car with my dad and my sister. Driving through rural, central Vermont. My dad remembers this place, from a long time ago, and he's trying to find it. He knows that it's on the right, down a national forest road. We head down one of the national forest roads, but it's kind of a big uphill, and our car is having trouble getting up it. And just as the ground starts to level out, we roll over a sizable log, and now we're stuck. I check our surroundings. No one has been here in a long time. Even the road is barely visible, almost completely covered with grass and dead leaves. I keep looking around, and I see a decrepit shack towards the left, probably 20 feet away. But, what? There's a lit fireplace there. That's weird. Does someone live here? There were certainly no car tracks on the road for a while, so they couldn't have been driving there or away from there. The shack was not livable. Collapsed roof, broken windows. But within the little fireplace, a fire is most certainly blazing. Then, I swear to God, there was a flash of motion by one of the windows. It was down low, so that, if it were a person, they would have had to have been crouching. I then see another flash of movement in the window on the other side of the shack. Now I'm scared. This flash looked like it was a really pale color, not like skin. I told my dad to look over. I don't see any more flashes of movement, or anything suspicious, besides the contained fire. But the fire is enough to creep him out because he redoubles his efforts to get unstuck. We got away from there as fast as possible. Short but sweet. I went to middle school on a military base. The place sometimes had parts recycled from older constructions in other locations. During my 7th grade finals, I had to pass, like really bad. I asked to be excused and was handed the keys to an otherwise handicapped-only restroom in the same hall. I'm still not entirely sure what happened. I walk in, realize this place looks like nothing else in the school, get the feeling I should hightail it out, and basically fled. I gave the key back to my teacher and just held on until lunch. In retrospect, a lot of things I saw in the brief moment I was in there are nonsensical. The place had walked twice the height of the hall I was in, with huge windows at the top that didn't exist outside. The place looked practically brand new, and the tile matched none of the laminate flooring. I still have no clue. Well, I suppose I'm really doing this. Ah well, here we go. So, there's a farmhouse in a small valley in central PA, just south of Lock Haven, which has been in my family for almost 250 years, and it is a well-known paranormal hotspot in the valley. Case 1, the demon hound thing that apparently has been throwing itself in front of motorists and carriage drivers and then disappearing right before getting hit occasionally for the past 100 or so years. I didn't actually know about this one until recently since we only visit occasionally, but we once stopped at a diner on the way down to visit my great-uncle at the farm. The local told us about how one of her friends had almost gotten into a major car accident when she was driving down that stretch of road in front of our farm and almost ran into a dog. Right as her car was going to hit it, it disappeared into thin air right in front of her. It doesn't happen very often, but it happens often enough that the locals know that there's a possibility that they may run into it when they're driving at night. We asked my great-uncle about it that day, and apparently there was a story that had been passed down from my great-great-grandmother, who was apparently scared to walk outside at night because of the big black hound with eyes of fire. this is by no means the creepiest thing which happens there. If this gets interesting, I'll elaborate, but I'm at work and can't spare more time to write about it. Me and my wife like to go for late night drives, like 2 a.m. drives, as we are both insomniacs. One night we were about 50 miles south of Chicago. We lived in the suburbs, and we came across what looked like a one-room bar with nothing else around, that had no parking lot, but in the grass for about 300 feet in both directions down the road was hundreds of identical white pickup trucks. It was so weird we booked it out of there. We have tried to re-find this place many times, both in the day and at night, but to no luck. A few years ago, I traveled to an abandoned inpatient psychiatric care for children. This also happened to be run by a Nazi supporter and eugenics champion, Dr. Jarnett. I have never felt more sadness in a building ever. But the scariest thing is, I got separated from the group as I was looking in the hydrostatic dunk tank and the morgue, and all of a sudden I heard laughing, like children laughing, all ringing out of the places you put the dead bodies in. I'm not sure if it was psychological or what, but I pretty much froze, but also oddly, I felt sad. Really uncomfortable, like I was mourning for people too. After doing more research on the asylum, the doctor performed heinous experiments on children, including forcibly sterilizing them and injecting blood and other chemicals. It makes me sad that, perhaps those kids are still stuck in hell on earth. I know I am haunted by the memory of just going in, but I can't imagine being stuck in there forever. I did go back a few months ago, and I suppose salvage crews came in and pulled out all the equipment, but a whole bunch of other things happened as well. I just hope those children aren't suffering anymore. They don't deserve that, not after what they've been through. My second post, I was driving my semi through some remote parts of Colorado to save some time to get to Cali, so it was midday, sunny and beautiful. I must have gone 30 minutes or so without seeing a house, car, or anything to resemble civilization. Then far in front of me, I saw what it looked like, a gas station. I was happy that I could stop, stretch, and get a cup of coffee before getting to climb the mountains. So, I got to it, and it didn't look like much, but you would not expect much there either. It was this old pump station with 2 old red pumps that most likely didn't work. I am getting out of my truck and all of a sudden I felt a chill down my spine. There was nobody there. You could not see anything around this old gas station, but I wanted some coffee and I processed to the small store. It looked okay, a bit dark inside, but I was like, what the hell, I have seen worse, and I proceed to pull the door that had the open sign on it. The door was locked and kind of got me by surprise, and I banged a bit my forehead onto the glass. Then I noticed the inside was fully covered, but was all covered with thick dust, so I looked closer through the glass, and I could swear I saw someone pulling back in the back of the room. Well, I took 3 steps back and sprinted to my truck and got out of there. In the basement of the chem lab at University of Illinois, there is this storage room. It's an old building and the room is blocked by a locked gate, but the gap between the gate and ceiling is just big enough to squeeze through if you climb the gate and avoid the electrical wires dangling. There's a bunch of old computers and furniture in there, and then a hole in the back wall that you can climb through. To the left is an ancient office with shelves of jars covered in a thick layer of dust. Nothing in them as far as I know. To the right is a room with human-sized depression in the ground, a cross, and an old photo of a guy. The story is that someone buried down there. I went down there at night to take pictures. I know that I got multiple pictures of the grave because I made sure to check them. But when I came back out to show my friends who were too scared to hop the fence, the pictures were gone and in their place were just pictures of black. Naturally, my friends didn't believe me, but I really don't have a reason to lie. A little more about the area. The older buildings are heated by steam and there are tons of old machinery that makes creepy sounds. Really adds to the atmosphere. It's weirdly warm and damp in the basements. There's another opening in the wall of the grave room that is just barely big enough for the army to crawl through if you once again avoid the electrical wires. On the other side is a tiny room with a staircase leading down. Supposedly there are satanic drawings, graffiti, and really old newspapers in the room at the bottom of the staircase, but it was locked when I went, unfortunately. All the rooms are made of brick and concrete with really thick layers of dust on them. That campus has a lot of cool urban exploring to be done. Here's a story about Daggett. If you ever decide to do Route 66, I suggest following history and starting in Chicago and heading west. Beginning the drive in Santa Monica loses any California beach charm it might have once you get about 2 blocks away from the ocean. From that point on, for about halfway through the state, expect 1-hour drives to take 3 hours and little signs that you are driving on the historic Route 66. Anyway, I started in Santa Monica. The hotel I stayed in the Georgian looks good from the outside, and it's on Ocean Avenue, so it's no slouch in the location department. But they are the people who work there some pure Californians. Long story short, save your money and stay somewhere where they won't treat you like you're taking up a room that could be filled by a significant person. Around noon, I finally made it past the outer rim of LA territory and into the San Bernardino Valley. Now I was on the Route 66 on my imaginings, 2 semi-maintained lanes with sparse traffic, sharp winding turns, and the feeling that if you died out here it would take at least 2 days for your body to be found. The San Bernardino Valley is not the least impressive valley I've seen. I was surrounded by smallish mountains and loads of desert bush. Every now and then, you have to get onto the interstate, but for the most part it's a straight shot of Americana with the 2-lane leading to some, surely glorious, point on the horizon between the mountains. Almost vomit-inducing. As I drove out of Barstow, the route meandered a bit and I got turned around more than once. When I found my bearings, I saw that the route was taking me into what looked like a border crossing area with a lone police officer, hand at hip. I turned around, but a check of the map and authority beyond cop told me to go forward. My 2 quick swerves must have made cop suspicious. As I pulled up he gave me the classic police stare and a once-over of the vehicle, looking for any giant bags of heroin that people always leave out in the open when they're in that business. "What's your affiliation?" he asked. I gave him a MN smile and said, "Oh, I'm just trying to follow Route 66. This, apparently, was not a reasonable statement. The police officer informed me that I was trying to enter a Marine base and would have to turn around. But he didn't quite want to let me go. "What brings you out here?" he asked again. I told him that the map directed me that way and that I was, after all, on Route 66 at that very moment. He seemed genuinely perplexed by my explanation when I told him that I was on a road trip. "What kind of trip?" he asked. "Road," I said. "Hot for that," cop said. Yeah, I said. Cop then asked for my ID and took the appropriately inappropriate amount of time to run me through the system. When he came back there was an extensive line of cars behind me. I have to say, none of them looked affiliated either. The police officer handed me back my ID. As I was about to drive away, he raised a hand. "One more thing," he said. "Whatever you do, don't stop in Daggett." Laughing a bit, I said, "Oh yeah, why, what's in Daggett?" Cop made a face that indicated that either his warning should have been enough, or 2, the fact that one should not stop in Daggett was self-evident and the truth of the proposition was complete by the invocation of the name Daggett. I pulled a UEY and headed back to the interstate to bypass the Marine base. "Look, I stopped in Daggett, okay?" At the next turn off I pulled back onto the route and saw a sign reading "Welcome to Daggett" in reasonably friendly type. You actually had to take a few extra turns to get to Daggett, so cop's warning seemed pretty superfluous. I mean, really, it seemed like he actually wanted me to stop in Daggett. Right? So, I took a few turns and pulled onto a road. It might have been called Daggett Road, I can't quite remember. There was a lone man walking on the street. He had baggy blue jeans and bright red suspenders over a dirty white shirt, untucked. I'd been hoping to pick up a hitchhiker somewhere along the route. But, suspenders probably make good ligature. In any case, the guy didn't appear to need a ride. He seemed more like he was just a Daggett man and didn't need to go anywhere else. As someone from northern MN who has lived a while in southern AZ now, I feel like I have a fairly good grasp of the real small town. There are usually a few trailers, maybe a couple of questionable dwellings where you see them and think, yes, a person could theoretically seek shelter there. But really nothing had prepared me for Daggett. Each block, or semblance of block, was like a collection of card houses put up by a 5-year-old who hated failure, so when one house went down he just moved on and slapped together 2 more cards. You could tell the people who lived here. There was that unmistakable lived-in feel. But other than the man with red suspenders, I didn't see anyone. I felt like I had to find the underlying cause of cop's invocation though. Like, what made Daggett above all other towns worthy of an official cop warning? Don't stop in Daggett. I was just pulling around a corner that contained something like a general store when I saw two small, lanky men slink out of one of the shanties and into a rusted Chrysler. I didn't see if they were wearing red suspenders. I have to tell you, I instinctively locked my doors. I hate doing that, I almost never do. It's such a superior gesture. Nevertheless, I did it now. I idled along a bit and decided, quite suddenly, that maybe I didn't want to know the reason behind "don't stop and dag it." There was just something dagged about the whole situation. Abandoning all of my normal let's see the real world and have adventures instincts, I turned my Honda around and noted right out of Daggett. I live in upstate New York and there is this town called Allentown. It's not actually called Allentown, but I don't remember the real name. Everyone calls it Allentown and everybody there has the last name Allen, and then they go make babies with their family members and the place is just a huge incest pool. If you drive up there and you're not from Allentown, they take the tires off your car. Oh man, I'm late, but have I been waiting for this question? Around 2002 to 2003, I can't remember. I was at my best friend's house for the weekend with another friend there as well. Now my friend lived pretty far from town down a country road in the woods. This East Texas. You had to turn off Farm Road and down a dirt road into the woods a couple of miles to get to his driveway, also dirt, and cross a small bridge over a pond to get back there. I'm going into detail too much, my point is he lived in the middle of nowhere. We had explored the woods around his house before but never went too far. This particular day we decided we were going to hike the woods much further. We were walking for a couple of hours and came onto a path clearly made by a four-wheeler and followed it. At the end of the path, which was only a couple hundred feet, there was a small clearing in the woods and in the middle a cabin. The cabin was a couple of feet off the ground supported by blocks and had a front deck. We decided to check it out, since we're dumb kids. The windows were all barred, the door was locked. It gets weirder. The cabin was surrounded by playground equipment. OLD playground equipment, like 1950s to 1960s era. When we walked behind the cabin, that's when we all three got really scared. There were several mounds of dirt and shovels lying about. Almost like graves, but we couldn't know for sure. We decided to leave at that point and found our way back to my friend's house. It gets weirder. A few years later when we were all around 16 years old it came up in conversation and we decided one day to go look for it again. This time we brought my friend's .22 rifle, just in case. We eventually did find the path again and followed it, but this time when we got closer we could hear people and decided to peek through the brush and see. Everything about the cabin looked the same as before, but this time there were four grown men with two four-wheelers standing there talking. And I mean some hillbilly-looking dudes, y'all. We were a couple hundred feet away from them and watched them for maybe 30 seconds before one of them spotted us and yelled out to us. He got on his four-wheeler, and we ran. We ran as fast as we could until we couldn't hear him anymore. After that we never went back. And my friend moved closer to town that year. It still gets brought up in conversation sometimes and all of us have a sick feeling about it. TLDR, my friends and I stumbled onto a creepy cabin in the middle of the woods when we're 13. Went back a few years later and was chased by hillbillies on four-wheelers. A little late to the party here, but what are you going to do? I'm from Connecticut, and my grandfather had a house up in a town called Prospect. Not too many people, but a lot of land. Before he died a few years back, I was driving up there to take care of him. His health was failing due to cancer, and I often left the house well after dark. I got to see the town at night, which, first of all, had no streetlights. It's basically a mountain town, nothing but silent dark woods. Basically murder territory. One night my transmission slips out of gear, something my then weird Pontiac Grand Prix liked to do a lot. I had to pull over on this very curvy road in pitch blackness, shut off the car and turn it back on again. Just before I turned the key to shut the car off, I noticed something in the brush. It looks like a piece of white clothing, but I couldn't get a good look as the headlights turned off. I turned the car back on immediately to see a blonde woman in a white gown standing up. Clearly the clothing was on the ground before, looking up at the sky, never saw her face. I almost hit myself as I threw the car into reverse and got out of there as fast as I possibly could. I have no idea what that could have been, and I try not to think about it anymore. I have dreams like this all the time, my current home, places I have lived, people that have passed away, including my wife, all slightly different. Whole towns, places, empty. And I only remember them at random times when I am wide awake. I always wondered if this was a peek into alternate timelines, or are they just dreams? I have wondered about this for a long time. Here's hoping someone can shed some light on this. Creepy, cause last night I had a dream like this. I went to this house of a man I had, in my dream, known for a long time. The whole time I was racking my mind for his name, but I could not remember it, only memories I had had with him. Inside his house were all these people I had seen before but didn't know. It was like a party was going on. I felt remarkably close to this man and like I had not seen him for a long time. I knew him well, his personality, what he liked, etc. Apparently we had met online a long time ago, and we had gotten along so well that I met him in person, at his house. In my dream, this was the second time I had gone to see him years after the first time, and I had crazy feelings for him at this point that I hadn't had the first time I visited. At one point in my dream, I tried making a move on him, we kissed, but he told me, to my disappointment, that it wasn't the right time and or place. The rest of the night, no matter what dream I was having, I was thinking of him and trying to figure out his name and feeling like I needed to get in contact with him again. I would be in half-dream states trying to figure out if we were friends on Facebook or if the original dream I had any truth to it. When I finally woke up, I realized that the man in my dream was actually a dying patient that I had taken care of the day before. The people at his house were his friends, in real life, who were sitting at his bedside as he passed away. All day I have felt so strange about it because yesterday was the first, and last, time I ever took care of him, so had never seen him previously, and at the time I was caring for him yesterday, he was already actively dying, so I never even got a glimpse at his personality. In middle school my friends and I once dared each other to go inside a group of abandoned buildings that were grouped together. The front doors were chained together, but we ended up finding an unlocked door in the back. As soon as we walked in there was a sleeping bag that felt so warm it felt like the person had just left. We ended up going into what looked like an Asian church and went through a back room. We found a bunch of boxes of toys and a big box of over 100 driver's licenses. The weird part was no two licenses were the same. Soon we saw police lights flashing through the windows and my friends ran up a ladder while I thought hiding in the same room was a better idea. After we all met up outside, my two other friends said they met someone on the roof of the building that was asking them how their day was. Creepy place, it was torn down shortly after. I was road tripping with a friend through lower Mississippi on the way to Florida. Pulled over at a random gas station in the middle of nowhere. I needed the bathroom, bad, so I ran inside while she pumped gas. Things were strange from the beginning. The store was destroyed. Broken bottles, open boxes, and trash were scattered everywhere. It looked like someone had been on a rampage. Still, I needed the bathroom, desperately. I pulled open the bathroom door and things went slow motion. Something bad had happened in there. Blood and other unspeakable body fluid were smeared on the walls. The toilet was full to overflowing with something. The fluorescent lights flickered loudly and the sink pipes leaked rusty water towards the drain in the floor. No way was I going in there, and I mysteriously no longer had need of the toilet. I turned to leave and made horrified eye contact with the clerk. He smiled widely, watching my reaction. He was also one of the most attractive people I've seen before or since. He could have stepped right out of a magazine. In that setting, he was even more surreal. My friend came in to pay for the gas, and I almost tore off her arm dragging her out of there. Two options. Either a movie set that we randomly stumbled on, or we arrived in the aftermath of a horrible crime. I actually watched the news later, but nothing was mentioned. About 6 friends and I got stranded in Baraboo, Wisconsin, Ringling Brothers Circus, due to a flood. We were headed up that way for camping. We found a dive motel and got 3 rooms, 3 to a room. Since they were adjacent, we thought it'd be funny to move the dozen or so odd pictures of clowns around in the motel rooms to pass the time while drinking. In my friend's room, he moved a picture and found a hole in the wall. We found that it was a hole that went through to my room. I won't say we didn't think much of it, but we didn't care really, chalked it up to townies, laughed it off, got drunk, went to bed. When we woke up, the guy asked us if during our next stay, we wouldn't move his art around as it upsets other patrons. Maybe not eerie on its face, but that place shouldn't exist. I lived by myself in far eastern Ontario for a little over 4 months. I often went on weekend adventures by myself since I didn't really know many people in this part of the province, and I was going through a breakup at the time. So, I would basically explore around eastern Ontario and western Quebec alone. There's a lot of history in that area, so there were a few spooky things I saw. One weekend I decided to go all the way to Quebec City, driving through the nice mountains in southern Quebec all the way there. I would leave after work on Friday and go about halfway before stopping at an Airbnb for the night to continue the next morning. On the way to my bib, I hit a deer going amazingly fast on the highway. I was fine and there was only minor damage to my car, so I continued on, but it definitely put me on edge a little bit, because prior to that I never told anyone where I was going and was really isolated. I took a slight detour on my drive to a small town I had passed through once before called Thetford Mines, Quebec, because I knew the drive-through there was scenic through the mountains. Once I came to town, the autoroute I was on suddenly was blocked off, so I took the only turn I could and pulled off at a small pull-off with a trail marker overlooking the small town. Across the road I see some train tracks, so carefully I follow them. The tracks lead into a small, wooded section, and had a huge, like 30-meter, pile of rocks and boulders on the other side, which meant I could only follow the tracks or go back the way I came. After a short walk around the corner where I was very paranoid about seeing a train, the tracks just disappear with a massive boulder sitting at the end of the track. The trees cleared and there was a massive toxic blue lake at the bottom of a massive cave in front of me, and between me and the lake were the crumbling remains of the highway collapsing into the massive hole and a small observation platform overlooking it all that was in bad shape. Windows smashed. It was clear there were a ton of landslides, saw toppled telephone poles that looked pretty new, so I didn't want to stay long, but it was the most apocalyptic thing I have ever seen. It turns out I had wandered into the world's largest asbestos mine, which closed in 2012 because too many workers and people living in the town were getting lung cancer from the asbestos. The original highway collapsed into the mine, so they built a second one, but it collapsed too, so now it just sits in disrepair. It was creepy as hell, super dangerous, but I've wanted to go back again ever since and show people. Might have picked somewhere if anyone's interested. I know this is super late, but when I was between 7 to 10 I lived in Maryland. My grandma had 10 acres of land and all of her neighbors had about the same. As kids, we would go exploring and my cousin would always tell me about the Deadpool, and I never believed him. So, one day, he takes me on his dirt bike into the woods for about 20 minutes and we come to this overgrown community pool. It looks just like you would imagine a community pool, tables and chairs and restroom, all that good stuff, but it's in the middle of the wood. It really was the Deadpool. We walked around and according to him, there weren't any neighborhoods close by, nor could we see any houses through the trees. It looked fairly modern for its time, the mid-90s, not like something built in the 60s and forgotten. As an adult, I'm sure there was a reason, like maybe there was supposed to be a neighborhood out there eventually, but standing there surrounded by trees as a kid, it definitely felt surreal. It's still something I sometimes feel like I dreamed. Me and my mom were heading into town in northern Sweden 14 years ago, and behind us we had a guy driving up close enough for both me and mom to see his face with an angry expression on it. Guy looked seriously angry, and he had all the long straight road ahead necessary to do an overtake if he really had to be somewhere, but he didn't. Mom looks at the rear mirror after about 10 to 15 seconds with him behind us, makes an angry face and says something to the tune of this guy and his version of keeping one's distance in traffic and looks at me and asks me if I recognize him. He was that close, like 2 to 3 meters behind our car. I look again, nope, no one I know. I look back at Mom saying just that, and she takes her eyes off the rear mirror and looks at me while I say nope for like a second, then back to the mirror. 1 second later, she takes the foot of the gas in surprise, because the car is gone. Now we lost the guy in the span of less than 5 seconds, and there are no roads leading off the main road we were on that he could have taken. Absolutely 100% none, and it's a long straight road lined with thick forest where the ditches are 100% visible. He had not driven into the ditch, his car would still have been tumbling when Mom looked back in the mirror if that had even been the case, he had not gone off the road in any fashion. He just vanished. And no, he did not overtake us in a blind spot. The road ahead was clear. Our car and his car were the only cars on the road at that time. It was a red Toyota Corolla -96. I know that because our neighbor owned a metallic blue one. Replates beginning with CW #-5 #, SWE regulates are in an ABC 123 format. I remember that much, plus a late 40s/early 50s man with brown hair, stubble on his chin, and the facial expression of someone who just got called into the work that he hates by the boss that he hates in the middle of foreplay with his wife on a Saturday evening. Never figured it out, probably never will. Chalked it down to shared temporary insanity and stopped mulling it over. My ex-girlfriend and I decided to have a sleepover. We're both girls, so this was allowed. She came over and we decided that around 9 at night we would go on a walk, and my stepmother agreed as long as we took our phones and flashlight. Where I used to live, people referred to it as a hidden utopia because it was so obscured by the woods. We headed out and went on a lonely path that cut straight through the woods with nothing around it but a stream and a tiny park. We laughed and joked, we played some calm music from our phones, and it was a cute little date. She stopped me suddenly and pointed up this large hill. She said she saw some cool-looking house, so we decided to crawl up the side of the hill. It was difficult since it was slippery, but we managed. There was old pottery scattered around the yard and ripped-up tires. We were standing behind an old house. It was falling apart, and the clock tower area of the house had been burnt down. She gave me her hairpins, and I went around the house trying to unlock the doors, but all of the locks were filled with cement and all the windows were either covered in spiky vines or covered up with boards. We found one loose board, and so I kicked through it. We slipped past the board and entered the house. The floor was mushy, and it smelled musty. With every step I took, the floor would make a squishing sound and dip under my weight. You could barely see the floor because it was covered in so much stuff. We headed towards the kitchen and looked through some of the books that had been stacked up in the kitchen. It seemed like whoever lived here had been evicted. She called me over and I rushed over to her panic-filled voice, and we saw a skull on the ground, and then we heard a door creaking open somewhere in the house. We booked it. We revisited it twice that week to look around it and figure out its mysteries. We looked it up on Google Maps, but Google couldn't find it. The third time we went there that week, it wasn't there. We crawled up the hill, nothing was there. All that was there was a few wooden blocks. Everything had disappeared, including the large tree right next to the house that was practically part of the house. We could never find the house again. It had just disappeared, and the hill was just a field of grass and flowers. I have pictures of the house on my phone, but it doesn't even exist. I was studying abroad in Italy my first year of college, and a group of friends and I were trying to find this bus station in Rome. We went to where Google Maps led us, and the building looked like it was an office building, of some sort. So, we're thinking, no, okay, maybe it's in the basement. So, we go into this building and get into the elevator, and there's no button for the basement, so we're like, okay, maybe if we go to the top floor we'll be able to have the vantage point to see the bus station from where we are. So, we go to the top floor and walk out, and we're greeted by this woman who's standing behind the counter at what appears to be a Chinese restaurant. So, we go in, and there's like, her, and a couple of kids playing on the floor near her. And we look around, and the windows are totally blacked out. And this woman looks at us, and, in a super thick Russian accent says in English, "What are you doing here?" So, by this time two of us are sufficiently freaked out, but the fearless one in our group goes, "We're trying to find the bus station. Do you know where it is?" And the woman answers, "It's in the basement." And my friend says, "Well, there's no button for the basement in the elevator." And the woman says, "No, you have to take the stairs." So, we thanked her and left super fast, went down the stairs pretty quickly, found the station and got on our bus. And for whatever reason, as we're pulling away, all of us decide to look out the rear window of the bus and see if we can spot the building. But it's not there. Just a regular old bus station. To this day we all maintain that we were in the Twilight Zone. I live in a town infested with shadowy people. Everyone sees them, and we have no idea where they come from or who they are. Kids, adults, teenagers, all kinds of ages report seeing them in schools, homes, and streets. Sometimes they'll even stand there in our churches. They seem harmless enough and usually they just stand there, but some of my family members have talked about having them loom over them and try and scare them as they sleep. Well, one day I was out in the town cemetery for a school project. There's a church on a little hill a little while away from the main cemetery. The cemetery is famous for being haunted, and some people refuse to breathe while driving by it in fear of breathing in spirits. I remember feeling really uneasy there, and I still can't look at some of the pictures I took due to the feeling I got. I had been there for about 4 hours and the sun was now setting. I got an odd feeling I was being watched, and I looked over at the church. A tall dark figure was looking over at me, and for a moment I strangely felt complete peace. I tried to think of a way to communicate that I meant no harm. I looked down at my camera and then backed up, and suddenly it was gone. I didn't feel so scared anymore, but I knew for certain I wanted to finish and leave as soon as possible. I used to sell magazines door to door about 4 years ago. This led to quite a few strange things happening, but nothing quite as strange as what Lexington, Nebraska had to offer. Now this place was pretty normal. At first, looked like most towns in the area, with cookie-cutter homes, a run-down side of town, and your usual assortment of weirdos, except for the good old American cult my friend and I encountered. We usually had about 5 people split up towns by streets, so we could hit a couple of blocks before being picked up for our next drop, while one more person is the car handler to pick everyone up to move them to new streets to cover more area faster. Well, my best friend and I got put 2 streets down from one another. We started knocking doors, but every door we got to nobody spoke English. Not uncommon, but in Nebraska it was a little weird. But oh well, no big deal, right? We talked on the phone, a little upset about a dud drop, so we planned to meet up a few blocks down if we didn't have any luck. So, I kept knocking doors, and at each door there was another family of people from seemingly all over the world that didn't speak a lick of English. I finally got lucky with an extremely friendly elderly lady that bought a couple of magazines. After the sale, I asked if her neighbors were friendly, and if I could reference her. Her demeanor completely changed. She swiftly exclaimed nobody lived there and not to bother, and abruptly shooed me away. A little weird again, but whatever. She was probably tired of a salesperson at her door. Well, as that happened, it turns out my friend was having the same luck and ran into an old man at the bus stop that asked him how old he was. My friend answered 18. The old man responded with, "Good. You can protect yourself from the weirds." Again, really weird. Probably nothing again, right? Okay, now it gets weird. The next house that nobody lived in was the first of many copy and paste houses that looked identical to the next several houses. I heard a dog barking inside and went up to the door, knocked, and nobody answered, so I creeped a peek through the door window, and all of the furniture was upside down? WTF, right? The next house I knocked at, a woman walked from a door that was visible from the front door, taking a sharp 90 degrees turn to walk straight ahead to the door with some type of military-level etiquette, and opened the door. She's wearing an old colonial outfit, pale almost white makeup, with a huge creepy smile, greeted me, listened to my pitch without blinking, tilted her, said, "We're sorry, we can't help you," and shut the door. The next house, same thing, same exact style house, but a man and a woman, same creepy outfits, same face paint, same smile, said the same thing to me. They were dressed like it was the 1800s, like WTF. Next house, same thing, and repeatedly. Until the final house. This time the person that answered cut me off and said, "We're sorry, we can't help you." Then called me by name. I didn't tell this person my name. They were likely told by the last house's residents on some weird letter system or something. I noted right out of there and called my friend. Get this, same thing happened to him, to the T. We called our car handler, freaking out. He came and picked us up, so we skipped a couple of streets to keep knocking, and at every house, everyone we asked about the weird went from friendly to defensive and angry and denied any knowledge of it until we were on the other end of town. Nobody on our crew believed us, but I stood by it. We were in the middle of a cult. TLDR, sold magazines door to door, ended up traveling to Lexington, Nebraska, home of some creepy cult. Every household the surrounding cult zone didn't speak English. The members lived in homes that looked identical and all wore white powder and colonial clothes. Creepiest thing I ever saw in a town. When I was a teenager in the 90s, we used to do some urban exploring with my friend. Our favorite was this every property in the middle of town. It was an old 2-story home set in 3 middles of an industrial area. It was completely run down and had a sign on the door that said, Academy 2000. The inside was filled with old, yellow newspapers. The floor creaked loudly, and it was a wonder we didn't crash through the floor and hurry ourselves. It was always completely dark, the windows were boarded up tight. We never stayed long because it scared the shot out of us. The last time we visited it I dropped something. When I crouched to retrieve it, got a glimpse of the newspapers. They were all really horror stuff. Looked like snuff, some of them. Imagine Rotten.com in its heyday. There were very realistic looking torture scenes and articles about disasters and violent, twisted crimes. The name of the publication was Academy 2000, We Will Prepare, or something like that. It was basically unreadable due to age and water damage. You could only read headlines. In addition to the twisted articles, there was a personal section. It was too small and damaged to read, but they looked like hookup proposals with weird euphemisms in terms like for feasting, tributaries only, and one I remember was have sleeper, will share. Creepy. The newspapers had an address for the print/office whatever, and it was the place we were at. We heard a noise from upstairs where we hadn't dared to go due to the damage to the stairs and the darkness. We bolted and saw someone looking at us from a second-story window that wasn't boarded. We didn't come back. What made it extra creepy was that years later when it was gone, no one remembered it. Not even kids that used to live close by. I was driving, I don't remember where to, through New Jersey, and I ended up getting onto a dirt road from a turn on a highway, I think. I ended up driving in the middle of the night, to some freaky abandoned broken down like farm or something, busted concrete buildings all over and hella scarecrows for some reason. I'm already freaking out, so I pull a U-turn, deciding I definitely am going the wrong way. I didn't see any scarecrows going back down the same road. When I was in college, a friend of mine asked if I wanted to help out with her photography project. I agreed, and a bunch of got into a car and drove to the outskirts of Rockford, Illinois, to some abandoned building. I was honestly surprised this was still around. There was nothing else but open fields and trees around it, very isolated. When we got in, the first thing that hits you is the stench, a mixture of BO, pass, and like musty dog. Looking around you could see that this place wasn't completely abandoned. There was neo-Nazi graffiti on the wall, empty bottles of beer and liquor, food wrappers, and the occasional syringe. Looks like this was a place for people to come and party after hours, but the random beds around also showed that some people called this place home. My friend asked us to just walk around and look at everything and to not pay attention to her. She had me chain smoking cigarettes because she knew I smoked and wanted pictures of someone smoking. The place gave this really weird, uneasy feeling, like we were being watched. I've been in abandoned buildings before, but there was something particularly sad about this one. I don't know why it was even still standing. Half of it appeared to have come down a long time ago, which is how we were able to get in. After we finished, we all got in the car and drove back to our college in pretty much silence. There is an old mental hospital about 20 minutes from where I live. It looks straight out of a horror movie. Of course, it attracts visitors on occasion, and I believe there's even some sort of movie or documentary about it. I've been there a handful of times with friends. The very first time we ever went, we walked around the back, where there was some sort of old service road, and looked inside. There was one lone light on in the middle of this massive open space. It was very odd considering this place opened in the early 1900s and closed 15 to 20 years ago. It's also near impossible to physically get inside. We stood there for a second, but next thing we know, about 100 yards away, the bright lights of a car flash on and are staring directly at us through a fence. We freeze. We hear tires screech. The car takes a hard left from its stationary position and disappears behind a small building that is part of the hospital campus. We're still frozen. We hear the tires screech again, and this car, I kid you not, fishtails around the corner and starts speeding directly towards us. We take off running. We ran past the barriers we parked behind so that the car couldn't get to us, pull out and drive off. Apparently, the other people we were with, who were in a separate car, decided it would be a clever idea to come back and check it out again. The car that chased us down ended up pulling in front of them on the side of the road, turned their car towards them, and flipped on their high beams so they couldn't see a thing. A man, whose face they couldn't make out, walks up to their car, and the first thing he asks them is, "Did you see anything? Did you go inside?" We thought that seemed like an odd question to ask. We didn't screw with that place for a while after that. There's a swampy small town called Alviso on the San Francisco Bay, between Mountain View and Milpitas, and when my friend came out here in the early 90s she had an experience at a hotel/restaurant that we couldn't find 10 years later. Basically, she and a couple friends, think biker goths who got hard being bullied and now are pretty tough, visited Alviso and saw a restaurant that advertised frog legs. Like, who even serves those, let alone brings attention to it with a big sign outside? It was weirder inside, dark, old and musty, with a large lobby with a broken-looking grand staircase just before a full dining room that was completely deserted. She said it felt like the Stanley Hotel from The Shining or something. The diminutive, elderly waiter and waitress seemed to appear from nowhere from a long hall with no warning and without being summoned. Like one of the first jump scares in a horror movie, 1 second they weren't there, then turn around and they're in your face when you never saw them walk towards you. They never saw them walk at all, they just stood there, far too close, smiling sinisterly. When they disappeared to get water and menus, the mood of this dark red, velvet dining room, coupled with the fact that no one else was in the restaurant or the building it seemed, for that matter, creeped them out and made them leave. Swiftly. Practically running. Like I said, we went back and couldn't find the place. We did see the roofs and fences sticking up out of the swamp that were abandoned by the 49ers who once lived there. I like to look at old pictures of the area and often wonder if I will see a restaurant with frogs' legs advertised on a big sign outside. A bit late, but I'm posting because I'm actually hoping someone can tell me where I was at the time, as this was about 20 years ago and well before I even knew what Gaps was. A friend and I had just visited the sand dunes in Colorado and were then driving east to go and meet a friend who we had gone to school with. It was a really dark night on one of those typical roads where there's really not much for miles. We had been driving for a few hours and thought we were lost, so we pulled over at the first turnoff we found to check the map. Once we turned off the road, our headlights picked up that we had turned onto an old road that had a large stockade fence with barbed wire running across it. That wouldn't have been so eerie if the fence weren't covered in radioactive signs warning us to keep out. Because we were young and a bit stupid, we decided to drive closer to see what was behind the fence. Once near the fence we noticed that it was an entire neighborhood that looked like it had been built in the 70s that was completely abandoned. Keep in mind that this was really late at night, nearly pitch blackout, and we were on a deserted road in what felt like the middle of nowhere. We quickly got scared out of us and went back to the truck and sped off. We stopped at the first gas station we could find, which was about a 20-minute drive, to fill up, and also asked the cashier about what we found. He was completely confused and said he'd lived there most of his life but didn't know what we were talking about. This freaked us out even more, as we figured anyone in the area would know about this for sure. Come to find out from our friend's dad that the neighborhood had their chimney stacks filled with radioactive stone, and it wasn't until the people living there started to die from similar types of cancer that they figured it out and condemned the entire neighborhood. This isn't so much creepy as it is WTF. Singapore is eerily efficient. I used to live on the east coast there in the early 2000s, and there was a seaside park that ran along the coastline for several miles. It had restaurants and attractions, and I liked to ride my bike along the shoreline path. One day I'd just gotten home after about a month of being out of the country. I rode down to the park and started off down the path. The first attraction I usually came to be conciliarism. This was a center for breeding crocodiles. It had a concrete visitors center and a number of outdoor concrete pools filled with crocodiles occupying about 2 acres. After I had ridden for a while and came to a row of restaurants, I realized that I'd probably spaced out, because I didn't remember seeing the conciliarism. I made it a point to look for it on the way back. When I turned around and made it back to the spot where the conciliarism had been, it wasn't there, nor were there any signs of recently finished construction or restoration. It had simply vanished. There were just mature palm trees and grass like everywhere else in the park. I found it very unsettling that they could make a well-known attraction disappear so effectively. I rode to the park with my roommate the next week, and he immediately stopped at the spot where the conciliarism had been and looked around with a confused look on his face. I know, I said, it's really weird, isn't it? The weirdest thing is that it may have been replaced fairly recently, as it's still listed as an attraction on websites. I'm a little late to the game, but the only unexplainable experience I ever had was driving on Interstate one time in the Midwest. I'd driven this route hundreds of times before, so I knew the signs, billboards, and towns pretty well that I was passing. I knew there were road signs with mileage for the town I was headed to right outside of the town I had just passed through, and sure enough I saw it, 31 miles to X. Normal so far, and I kept driving. The weirdness happened after this. I have no idea how long I was driving after I saw that sign. It seems like all my sense of time got fuzzy or stopped, although at the moment I didn't notice anything, and the next thing I remembered I was passing the same 31 miles to X sign. That's what brought me out of the haze. I was thoroughly confused and felt like I'd been driving for at least a good 30 minutes after the first time I saw the sign, so I should have been close to my destination, but I also couldn't recall anything after I'd gone past the sign the first time. I couldn't remember what time it had been or what time it was supposed to be, if that makes any sense. It was still late afternoon/evening, which seemed right, but I had no idea if it should be 6 p.m. or 9 p.m. or anywhere in between. The other weird thing is that my parents would always tell me to call them when I got back to my place, where I was headed, and I usually always did, but occasionally I would forget. This time my mom called me when I was still 10 or 15 miles from my place, expecting me to be back already, which confused me even more since I was still on the road. It's not as creepy as a lot of other stuff in this thread, I suppose, but it is the only thing like this that has ever happened to me. To this day I still have no way of explaining it, although there are a bunch of options I've considered, ranging from a split personality taking me on a detour, an alien abduction, or maybe carbon monoxide poisoning, although not seriously. The most plausible thing is I just imagined seeing the sign the first time, but I know the sign is right past the town I had driven by and don't feel like I would have imagined driving all the way through the edge of that town and then past the sign. The only other thing I could think of is that someone had just put up two 31-mile signs instead of the one a couple of miles later that says 27 miles. This makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't explain why I felt like a lot more time had passed and why I couldn't remember what hour it was even supposed to be, or why I was evidently late enough getting home that my mom called me to make sure I'd made it. Every time I drive past that sign to this day, I still make sure and see that it says 31 miles, and I've never had anything else ever happen again, but some kind of glitch in the matrix happened to me that one evening. Zion, Ohio, the town that doesn't exist. I was dating a guy who lived in the Hocking Hills region of Ohio. His house was basically a straight shot down 664, but you had to pass Old Man's Cave and a few other attractions that were always filled with tourists and filled with people who couldn't drive worth a thing. I'm not sure the reason, but one day I decided 664 would take forever, so I went down a side route my boyfriend used to take. I'm really not sure what happened. I know I missed a turn, but from there what happened is anyone's guess. I kept going, and as I drove it seemed darker and the area became foggy. I keep driving super confused about where I am. I've got no cell signal of any sort, and my phone can't get a caps lock either for my offline maps. Next thing I know I'm in a town that just kind of happened out of nowhere. It's very foggy, it's so dark for a Friday afternoon too. I have this terrible feeling I can't shake. Nothing seems right. There are only a few houses, but they all seem slightly off. There were no garages on the houses and no cars anywhere. I kept driving and saw a sign. Welcome to Zion, Ohio. Now this wasn't a small sign made by the state or anything like that. This was a billboard-sized sign that had obviously been painted by the community. It was those words on the bottom with a bunch of hills, and on top of the largest hill was a church that had a painted glow around it. I swear to this day I took a photo of the sign. I have never been able to find that photo. Anyway, I keep going and I pass what I assume is the church shown in the painting. There are two cars there and a few people standing in the cemetery next to it. They were facing the roads towards me but paid no attention to me at all. I keep going, and as I go on, the houses look like they are falling apart. Then the fog clears up and suddenly I come out on a road that goes to 664. I start driving down 664 and get reconnected to cell signal. I check my phone and I have a few missed messages from my boyfriend asking when I'm going to get there. According to my phone clock I spent an hour on that detour, but I swear it was only 15 or so minutes. I told my boyfriend about it, and he thought I was pranking him. I've Googled it and I can't find a Zion, Ohio, let alone a Zion, Ohio, that is near Hocking Hills.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.